Today we're going to talk about specifically what you need to do to decide to put together a pilot. And it's something that we would review at headquarters in the Office of Federal Operations. I'll talk more about that in a moment, but let me finish introducing myself. I've been working at the Office of Federal Operations at EOC for many years, and like my training partner, Robin DuPont, we started out writing a lot of appellate decisions. And we did that for many years. And we went on to do other things like delivering training, engaging agency personnel, finding out where the problems lie at the agency level, and trying to improve the complaint process. Can everyone still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Robin is, in fact, she is one of the two pioneering attorneys who put together all things pilot, everything from the creation of the PowerPoint we're going to go through today, as well as the toolkit that you'll need to look at the agency if you want to put together a pilot. And even if you decide you're not able to do it this year, you can always do it next year. We're going to talk about the submission period. It's generally a 2-week period when you've got to submit it annually. And we're going to get to all of that. We've got a slide presentation that's well over 60 slides. So we're going to cover a great deal of information. Anything else I want to note before we get started? We also have a presentation that Robin, in fact, she did this in 2017. And in fact, if you put it in a search for EOC pilot, of course, on your own time, you're bound to get this presentation, which was done 3 years ago. And Robin conducted it then. So that's for folks who might say, hey, I'd like to see more about the presentation today or a rerun of it. It's out there, and it's on our website at eoc.gov. Bear in mind, because it is, it's a pretty comprehensive presentation, that we're probably going to answer most, if not all, questions that you have. So bear with us. If you've got a question, though, in the meantime, you don't want to hold on to it. It's all right. You can just send it, and Mark will channel it through the chat, and we'll respond. But bear in mind that Robin and I will be available at the end of the presentation to answer any other questions that you might have, okay? I'm going to get it started. Everyone can see okay? All right, I've got a little box on my window. Let me pull it down. All right, we're going to start a bit about the background of the pilot process. Since 2002, the Commission, in consultation with stakeholders, has been considering ways to reform the federal sector process. To further this goal, the Commission regulations now allow agencies to propose pilot projects that would grant an agency a variance from the administrative process set forth in 29 CFR Part 1614. Okay? What are the purposes of a pilot? The purposes of a pilot project are to, 1, allow an agency to enhance its administrative process and provide information to the Commission as it continues to consider reforms to the Part 1614 regulations. Now, I just wanted to note here that, historically, whenever we've had stakeholder meetings at the Commission, there's always been a segment of the population has said to us, is there a better way to process your complaints? Is there a more efficient way to do it? Maybe there's a better way, and we'd always say, well, we're always open to a better way, and that's the motivation behind the pilot process, the pilot variance process. We want to hear what agencies think, how they can do it better. But keep in mind, While the plan might certainly be a benefit to the agency in terms of efficiency, we're also concerned about fairness to the complainant. We don't want the complainant to be left out of the process and in any way be subjected to unnecessary burdens or unfairness just for the sake of agency efficiency. So that's something you'll see highlighted throughout our subsequent slides, okay? All right. Before you begin, first, consider why you want to initiate a pilot. Are there aspects of Part 1614 that you believe hinder you in doing a more effective job? Identify why you believe the regulatory provision hinders you and develop an approach to remedy that. Be sure the remedy does not disadvantage complainants. And we're going to talk again more about that. The most important thing to remember, foremost, a pilot must ensure that participants' rights are protected. The pilot must ensure fairness, justice, neutrality, and voluntariness, not infringe or deny any statutory rights, and ensure there is an adequate record for a potential appeal or hearing. What information should an agency review before drafting a pilot request? Well, a good starting point is 29 CFR 1614-102F, and that's where the language that allows pilots to actually be done. That's where it was amended. Our regs were amended a few years ago to ensure agencies knew what the process entailed. So that's a good starting point. And again, you all, if you work in EO offices, you know that by now. And if not, you can certainly go to our website at eoc.gov. Management Directive 110, also found on our website, Chapter 1, Section 10, also has an abundance of information of what you should consider before crafting a pilot. Now, bear in mind, we're going to talk about this, but you know, it's something that requires some work. It's more than just a notion to say, hey, EOC, we can do this better. We can save more time. It requires some work. It also requires some buy-in from those who work at the agency, especially in management, to ensure this is something that the agency wants to try for a designated period of time, usually 2 years or less, is the time period for the pilots that we approve at the Office of Federal Operations. Lastly, Pilot Project Toolkit. That's available, of course, on our website. It's a long, web citation is here, but all of these can be found on our website. Okay, you can just put in a pilot search and it should come up. But Robin, she was part of crafting all of this, and it's pretty comprehensive. It's pretty comprehensive. Some of the stuff you might say, well, it's rather straightforward, but we tried to answer every question you might have in putting together a pilot proposal so that it will be, one, accepted by the commissioners, and then two, that it will be successful in the end, that you all can say in the end, we actually accomplished whatever our goal was in terms of amending in some way the way that you processed your internal EEO complaints, okay? All right, we'll move on now. Other preliminary steps. Make sure that you have approval from appropriate officials in the agency to conduct the pilot. This is important. For sub-agencies especially, you must discuss the plans for a pilot with officials at the parent agency before submitting it to EEOC, and provide documentation that you have done so with the proposal. Now, it would be great to have formal documentation. You'll sign off of such and such of this particular office. It may be an exchange of emails. That would be sufficient. Something that we could look at as being tangible, showing that there was buy-in from the parent agency, okay? And it hasn't been an issue for us thus far, all right? Drafting the pilot proposal, or what should the pilot include? the what and the why. This is the meat of it. The pilot proposal must identify the specific sections of 29 CFR 1614 that the agency wants a variance from, and explain why the agency believes that section should be changed. The agency should also provide a detailed explanation of what the agency will do instead and why the proposed new approach might be better. Use clear and concise language. The proposal should specify what exactly the agency proposes to do. Provide enough information that the agency can clearly determine what the agency wants to do. Include any information specific to your agency which would impact the pilot and which the commission might not be aware of. So again, it requires some work on your end. Now look, Robin and I, we're available. If you have a need to call us, contact us, or send us an email. You have questions along the way, it's all right. But we want you to also understand that all this information has been put together for you, whether using the toolkit. A lot of this stuff is already prepared and on our readily available on our website. Okay.
This is particularly important for our defense agencies and agencies that use a lot of acronyms. If you use a lot of acronyms, please at some point, preferably at the beginning of your proposal, make it clear what the acronym stands for. We've gotten a few proposals in the past where it's difficult to tell and we have to follow up because we're not really sure what a particular acronym stands for. So make sure that or specific terms that are unique to your agency. Make sure to define them in the pilot. More information is usually better. Just anything that you think the commission should know, put it in there.
All right. Benefits and the effect. The agency should explain the expected benefits of the pilot in the proposal, as well as the pilot's expected effect on the EO process. That's important. Benefits of the pilot should, 1, apply to the EO process, right? 2, make the process more efficient and or fair. So it's important we can't forget this now. The whole purpose of it, what? Is to in some way improve your processing of your complaints that come your way. It might be on the informal side, it might be the formal, it might be both sides. You might want to submit more than one particular proposal. Just make sure we can distinguish the two. They have two different names. And again, efficiency is a big deal, but equally important is ensuring that it is fair to the participant, okay? Benefits continued. How does the proposed pilot differ from the process set forth in Part 1614 and Management Directive 110? We certainly want to know that, right? How will it improve the EEO process? That's the initiative in wanting to do it in the first place. So that should be readily apparent to us as well. Now, a sample pilot proposal. At the time the complainant submits a formal complaint and opts into the pilot, the agency will offer mediation within 5 days. If the complainant chooses not to participate in mediation, the agency will obtain documentation and conduct a fact-finding conference within 45 days. The complainant can opt out of the pilot after the fact-finding conference and return to the traditional EO process at the hearing stage. If the complainant does not opt out, a final decision will be issued within 20 days. Now, this is just a sample. Now, why is this a good proposal, we might ask? Well, it outlines the steps involved in the pilot. It includes a voluntary opt-out provision. That's something we want. And a note about opting out. Robin's going to talk more about that, but it should come at a good point, typically right after one stage has concluded. I don't know, it might be right before someone files a formal EEO complaint, right before the EEO investigation would be scheduled to begin, or a fact-finding conference anything where you can see a definitive beginning and ending point, those are ideal times to opt in and opt out of a pilot, to give that option to a complainant. The success of the pilot can be measured. All those things were noted in that sample on the prior slide. It's important in the very end that an agent be able to show, well, not only did we complete the approved pilot EEOC in the year or two that we conducted it, but these are our results. And hopefully you can show that it was a benefit. If it's the other way, that should also be apparent as well. And we'll talk about that more in the upcoming slides. Okay? An important note, when considering a pilot, review 1614 Regulations Management Directive to determine if it's what? Something you're proposing can already be done through our regulations. And I got to emphasize this. We have gotten proposals over the years, oftentimes folks wanting to do what they're already equipped to do. Our regulations, our management directive says you can go ahead and do this. Typically, it might be an extended EEO counseling. Someone might say we want to extend. Well, we already provide like 90 days extension counseling. That's already provided in our regs in the informal processing of complaints. And typically along the way, an agency generally can allow some extension for processing anyway, because if the complainant agrees to it, there's two people on the same page. Our process, traditionally, we will allow some kind of extension, especially early on in the process, because we want the process to work for both parties. And so that typically that isn't an issue, and that's something, again, that the agency can already do. So please, we're emphasizing what? Check out our Management Directive 110 and 1614. Why? Because a lot of the stuff we've already designed in our regulations. And we don't want you all spending the effort trying to change something that you're already allowed to do, okay? Here are some examples. Following are already allowed. Provide mediation or settlement negotiations at the informal pre-complaint stage. We already allow that. Extend the time for an investigation if both parties agree. Conduct ADR at the pre-complaint and formal complaint stages. That's already there in the regs. And provide conflict counseling or training. That's already there in our management directive, okay? Also include information about the pilot itself. The agency should clearly define the stages of the pilot. I mentioned that already. For example, if the pilot will encompass the informal counseling stage and the formal investigation stage, it should be specified in the proposal. We believe in keeping things simple and very clear so that anyone who reviews it can get a very apparent understanding of what you're intending to do, okay? Participation in education. The pilot proposal should state who may participate in the pilot and how the agency will safeguard the employee's rights. The proposal should also include a plan for educating employees and EEO staff about the pilot. And I find this to be especially important. It's one thing for, I don't know, it might be a small EEO office at an agency. It's wonderful if everyone in the office knows about how great this pilot proposal is and it's been improved, but it's quite another if the folks that you want to participate, employees you want to utilize to consider the pilot, that they also know how well the pilot should work for those affected. And of course, any office in the agency that's a part of the pilot should be well informed. I mean, a lot of this we think is common sense, but education is important. Now, who may participate? Components, facilities, or any positions that are available that needs to be noted in your pilot. It may be a huge, I don't know, department level agency, but perhaps certain decisions aren't included. You all should specify again, in the pilot, those offices that are included. Identify the criteria for selecting participants. That should all be clear during the educational process of the pilot. And bear in mind, when we talk about educating folks at the agency, I found it to be an ongoing process. We had recently FAA did a successful pilot, and it dealt with fast track. It's called the Fast Track Complaint Program, and essentially it abbreviated the investigative and counseling process, reduced the amount of days, and it was important that employees at that agency knew about it ongoing, because keep in mind, this is government, right? People move on, people promoted, people retire, new people are hired on board every month. And it's important that you have this information probably in a designated place for new employees as well. Anywhere, maybe an internal website at the agency, you have so that folks are ongoing, know what's going on, what their options are when they want to proceed to file or seek EEO counseling, file a complaint or seek EEO counseling. Okay?
I'm not sure if it's clear in the slides, but one of the components of identifying the criteria for selecting participants might be the issues that the person is raising in their complaint or their claim. We had one pilot that limited participation to those with what they called the more straightforward issues. They excluded claims of, for example, sexual harassment, hostile work environment, reasonable accommodation claims, and claims that tended to be a little more involved and a little more tricky. So you can work your pilot so that it includes specific issues, but not other issues as well.
And it should be, again, as Robin said, very clear from the beginning as to what the expectations are and what claims are accepted. We don't want complainants, employees left guessing because it doesn't work well for the success of any pilot, okay? All right, data analysis. This is important too. The pilot proposal must contain a data analysis plan that specifies how the pilot's success will be evaluated. The information must specifically address the concerns raised by the agency in requesting the variance. Okay? We need to know exactly what's going on. Further information should include this. 1, the agency name, of course, sub-agency, if any, point of contact information. Specify the dates and duration, not more than 24 months now. That's 24 months we think the commission decided was a good time to run a pilot. 3, we should include the information showing whether the agency is operating within the regulatory guidelines. Lastly, identify necessary changes to agency agreements. Changes to the collective bargaining agreement would be a good example. We don't want folks on one side saying, hey, we were never informed. We want everyone on the same page, and that's an important ingredient for a successful pilot. Okay?
Yeah, with regard to the number 3, that typically means that you're submitting your 462 reports, you're meeting any other reporting requirements, and those type of things. If you are not, that could be a problem. We want to approve pilots only for agencies that are in compliance with the rest of our regulations before we allow you to make variances from the processing part of the regulation. We don't want you to resubmit your 462 reports or anything like that. Reports that you've already submitted are fine. Just note in the pilot, just give a specific note that says we're current on our reporting, and that's fine.
Can a proposal be amended later? Well, all the necessary information must be submitted with the pilot proposal. The submission period, again, begins on March 31st. EEOC's Regulation 1614-102F states this, and the provisions of MD 110 provide that pilot proposals must be submitted by April 15th. So yes, it's about a 2-week window. It's important that you get all your information together, reviewed. I mean, this is just a strong suggestion from us before deciding to actually submit it. We know this requires a good deal of work on your end at the agency, but at the same time, we want you all to submit something that commissioners will approve. Keep in mind, if it's approved now, it would start the beginning of the next fiscal year, October 1st. So if you gain approval, let's say by the summer with us, then the pilot would begin October 1st, starting the next fiscal year. So it's important to also keep in mind, I said this in the beginning, we know that because of the work required, you might want to submit now something, but we rather that you get it right. You might have to ultimately decide to do it the next year, the next season of the next fiscal year. It's not the end of the world if you have to do that, and we're here to help you in the interim. But we want you to submit something that's going to gain approval by EEOC commissioners. All right, that's a big concern for us on our end. Okay, Robin, did you want to add anything to that?
I just want to say that generally the answer to can a proposal be amended later is no. In extreme circumstances, unusual circumstances, the commission may allow an agency to amend, but that's not a given. So work your proposal with the assumption that when you submit it between March 31st and April the 15th, that is your final product. That being said, anytime between now and April the 15th, if you need, you have questions or you want to just run something by OFO beforehand, you can always submit questions to its federal sector EEO, and this is at the end of the slideshow, at eeoc.gov with pilot question in the subject matter. You can submit your questions that way. I'm happy, if you want to email me personally, I'm happy to respond to you. If we need to, I can figure out a time when we can talk on the phone. My email is robyn.dupont@eeoc.gov. But we would rather work with you before the deadline to get something put together than to have to come back and ask you for more information later.
All right. Robin, I'm going to let you take over now.
Okay. Some important considerations that you need to remember while you're going through the process, and I know we're sort of beating this over the head, the fairness consideration. It's a huge consideration. It's been the last few years for the commissioners when they review this. The commissioners review all of our pilot proposals. They vote on them before they're approved. And fairness to the complainants is a big concern and has been in the past. And as we've noted, the pilot must take into account fairness to the complainant and make sure that their rights are protected. The pilot, mostly the opt-in and the opt-out provisions, should not be unduly burdensome to the complainant. Fairness includes not placing an undue burden on the complainant who's participating in the pilot. They're helping us improve the process by participating in the pilot, so we want it to be as easy for them as possible. For example, we had a pilot proposal in the past that required the complainant to make a second attempt to contact the EEO counselor when ADR through the pilot was not successful. It required the complainants to then go back and recontact the EEO counselor, and the commission found that really was an undue burden. The complainant had already made their initial contact with the counselor, and requiring them to go back and make a second contact wasn't acceptable. Participation must be voluntary. This is a big consideration too. It's one of the most important provisions to include in your pilot proposal is a knowing and voluntary opt-in, opt-out provision. The opt-in, opt-out provision, again, must be included in the pilot proposal, and it must be fair to the participants. If there are multiple steps in the process, Navarro touched on this a little bit a short while ago, if there's multiple steps in the process, then you may consider when you're making your proposal, allowing the participants an opportunity to opt out at each stage. For example, in the example that we talked about, where there was a mediation stage, an initial gathering of document stage, and a fact-finding conference stage, you could allow the participants an opportunity to opt out at each one of those stages. Just a reminder, make sure that the participant has a reasonable, sufficient amount of time to consider whether they wish to opt in. The Commission hasn't really, they haven't really put a time frame specifically on what is sufficient, but just make sure that it's not, the opportunity isn't up there and then it's sort of an immediate here, decide what you want to do kind of thing. One example, this is an example, just a caveat too, this is sort of the legalese that runs by on the commercials that you can never understand because it just goes by so fast. But this is the sort of caveat that any of the examples we're using today would not necessarily be approved if you submitted them. We're just using them as examples. But this example is upon filing a formal complaint, the complainant will receive a written explanation of the pilot program, which provides an expedited investigation, and be advised that he or she can opt out of the pilot at any time prior to the issuance of the final agency decision. This relates back to the example that Navarro talked about. When the complainant opts out, the pilot terminates, and the complainant is returned to a comparable point in the traditional EEO process. This would be the language that you would use, an example of language that you could use in your proposal that would be given to the complainant as part of their voluntary opt-in, opt-out notice. And this example is sufficient. It discusses all of the steps of the pilot. It mentions allows the complainant to opt in, opt out at any stage because this example that we just talked about is adequate. That's what makes it sufficient for your pilot proposal. It adequately ensures that complainants who opted into the pilot could protect their rights. A second example, the EEO counselor will explain the EEO process and the pilot during the informal complaint process. The notification of complainant's right to request a hearing or a final decision will notify the complainant that if he or she does not make an election within 30 days of whether or not to request a hearing or a final decision, the complaint will be dismissed for abandonment of the process. That was the pilot. The pilot was to add this dismissal element for complainants that don't make an election within 30 days. The Commission found that this was not an acceptable opt-in, opt-out provision, and that automatically placing complainants into a pilot, which in this case, if you didn't take any action, you were automatically in the pilot and your complaint was automatically dismissed. And the Commission was not satisfied that was a voluntary opt-in, opt-out provision. Automatically placing complainants into a pilot is obviously not voluntary, and this did not adequately protect the complainant's rights. A further example, and the reason why we're offering so many examples is that we figure we consider this to be a very important part of the pilot is the fairness to the complainant and the opt-in, opt-out provision. In this example, the EEO counselor will explain that the pilot allows the agency to unilaterally extend the period for investigation if the determination of an extension is necessary. The pilot will apply to all complainants who file formal EEO complaints. So everybody is in the pilot, and the agency can decide whether or not to extend the time. I think we can all agree that this is, if you probably know what's coming, that this did not include a provision that was voluntary for the complainant to opt out, because the agency controlled the opting in and chose which complainants it was going to opt into the pilot based upon its determination of whether or not it needed a period of time to extend the investigation. Commission concerns, some commission concerns that you should be aware of. The commission, again, had concerns that participants in the pilot, the examples that we talked about that weren't sufficient, the participation was not voluntary, and that the pilot would have negative ramifications for participants, because some participants, if the agency decided they needed more time and automatically placed you into the pilot, then it was obviously going to take more time to process your complaint than the regulations would specify. You need to have a plan. We talked about this a little bit, but have a plan for educating employees and your EEO officers. EEO officials that will be working with the pilot need to have a really good understanding of what the pilot is about, what the requirements of the pilot are, and should be able from day one to move ahead with the pilot. Also, you want to sell your pilot. You want to market your pilot. One of the pilots that we have approved, their first quarter was spent. The first quarter of the first fiscal year of the pilot was spent educating employees and EEO staff, and really marketing the pilot to the employees to get buy-in, so that employees, EEO staff, EEO directors and EEO staff know that employees some of them are inherently suspicious of the EEO office just from the get-go. And so you really want employees to feel good about their participation in the pilot and really be encouraged and really be kind of excited about the fact that they're trying something different. Again, you want to, we cannot emphasize this enough, ensure that participants' rights are protected. The pilot must ensure fairness, justice, neutrality, and voluntariness, as Navarro said, not infringe or deny on any statutory rights. For example, the right to file a civil action, that would right to pursue an MSPB complaint if that's appropriate. Those type of rights shouldn't be infringed on by the pilot. The agency should also maintain adequate records for any potential hearing or appeal. And we want to hear in your proposal how you're going to do that. There we go. The data analysis plan. This is probably the trickiest part of the proposal. It's the part that we really pour over the data analysis plan when we're reviewing a pilot, just to make sure, because the purpose of doing a pilot program in the first place is hopefully you guys are on the front line of the EEO process. Hopefully you all will be able to come up with some really good ideas and some really good changes to the process that, if it's working, if we determine that it's working, that we could then go and advocate as changes to the entire process. But how are we going to do that? We have to make sure that there's a way that we can convey that the pilot was successful. We have to have some information and some data to back us up. And that's where the data analysis plan comes into play. So the pilot proposal must include a clear data analysis plan with objectively measurable goals. And that's key. It's objectively measurable. How can we measure whether or not the pilot is successful? We want an objectively measurable goal. This actually came from a GAO report in, I forget what year, it was a long time ago. 2009. So it was a
Yeah.
while ago. GAO did this report and looked at the very first pilot that we ever did back in the day, and looked at it and determined several changes that they thought EEOC should make, several concerns that they had that they thought EEO should request that agencies address before approving a pilot, and the objectively measurable goals and the data analysis plan were one of those things. There's the link is there for the, and I think Mark said he would send out the slideshow, and Navarro mentioned it's included on the website, the previous version of the slideshow, which is not too different from the one that you have, and I believe the toolkit as well includes a link to the GAO report. If you'd like to go look at it, it's kind of dry, having read it myself, but it's there if you want to take a look at it and see what they have to say about the data analysis plan. So objectively measurable goals. What is an objectively measurable goal? It's one that can be supported by the data that you're going to collect as part of your pilot. Again, based upon GAO's recommendations, agencies need to collect data to support the goals of the pilot, and the Commission has found this to be a concern for pilot proposals that we've seen that did not contain objectively measurable goals. Some things to think about. When developing goals for the pilot, think about how you're going to measure them. For example, suppose the goal of your pilot is to reduce the time it takes to process complaints. So this would be an objectively measurable goal. A reduction in the processing time can be measured by data regarding the average processing time for claims in the pilot versus the average processing time for claims in the traditional EEO process. So reducing the processing time would be an objectively measurable goal. You can collect data as part of your data analysis plan. That would be acceptable. Another example, what if your goal is to increase the number of claims resolved through the informal process at the EEO counseling stage? This is also objectively measurable. The number of claims resolved at the informal stage under the pilot compared to data regarding the number of claims resolved during the traditional EEO counseling process. So both this goal and the goal that we just talked about are objectively measurable goals. So here's a few more. What about these goals? Increased accountability, improvements in the quality of complaint processing, employee empowerment, increased customer satisfaction. I think you probably all know where we're going with this. These are goals that are difficult to measure. I'm not saying you can't do it, but finding objectively measurable data to determine accountability, quality, and that type of thing is going to be difficult. So we're going to be really interested in, if you choose these kind of goals, what kind of objective data you're going to collect to support whether or not they're successful. Customer surveys may be an option, but again, customer surveys tend to be very subjective, and it's hard to objectively measure that. Metrics for measuring success. You need to indicate in your proposal, identify what metrics you're going to use to measure the success of your pilot. So you have your goals. How do you determine what your metrics for success are going to be? Well, for example, you can use a specific percentage range in the reduction of time to process claims, or an increased number of claims resolved at the informal stage. For example, if we're looking at reduction in processing time, the objectively measurable goal could be we want to see a reduction of between 15 and 20% in the time it takes. So you would look at what is the average time for claims in the traditional process, EEO process, and what is the average time for claims in the pilot. And if you see a 10 to 50, it doesn't have to be an exact percentage. We're not looking for, we want to see a 3.56% reduction. It can be 10 to 15% reduction. We've also had pilots where their goal is not to see that right off the bat, like the very first quarter or very first 6 months of the pilot. They've increased it. So for example, in the first quarter of the pilot, they want to see a reduction of, say, 5%. And then the second quarter, they want to see a reduction of maybe up to 10% and increased it as you go along. So you don't have to see the exact, the final goal right at the beginning. Some things to consider when working on your objectively measurable goals and the metrics you're going to use. Think about, could the success of a pilot be measured by a reduction in the amount of time required at the administrative hearing stage, or what about a reduction in the number of claims dismissals overturned by the commission? That may be something that you're considering. However, that is really not within the agency's control. So you want to make sure that you're measuring things that you can control as an agency. There's a number of different factors that come into play when you're talking about an agency hearing and reducing the time of an agency hearing. The AJ schedules, different things that come up in cases, representatives availability, things like that. Dismissals overturned by the commission. Again, that's not really something that the agency has control over. So that's probably not a good thing to include as your objectively measurable goal. When you draft your pilot proposal, you must identify what data you're going to collect. Again, are you going to collect data regarding the average length of time to process, the number of complaints resolved at a particular stage? Make sure the data collected relates to your objectively measurable goal. Think about what data you will need to determine whether the pilot is successful. At the very end, think ahead and think about, ask yourself, what data is going to help you determine whether or not and help us determine whether or not the pilot was ultimately successful. Baseline data, an agency should collect both baseline data before the pilot begins as well as data from the actual pilot. That really helps you compare the pilot to the traditional EEO process. It shows us, what's been going on in the traditional EEO process and how the pilot has helped change that. So that baseline data assists us in making comparisons between the pilot and the traditional EEO process. Make sure that the baseline data is readily available to your agency and does not rely on data collected by other agencies. We had one pilot proposal that said that they were going to base their baseline data was going to be data that EEOC had, and it turned out that it wasn't data that we actually had, or it was data that they were relying on data from a different agency, or for sub-agencies. Make sure that you can get it easily either at your sub-agency or make sure ahead of time that you can get it from the head agency. So what if your pilot involves changes at the investigative stage and the goal is to reduce the time taken to complete the investigation? That sounds reasonable. Measures of success could be to compare the average number of days taken to complete an investigation in the traditional EEO process with the average number of days taken at during the pilot. And you could measure your success by the specific percentage that you note in your proposal. So, for example, if you noted that you wanted to see a reduction in average days by up to 20%, then the data could either support or not support that, but it would be an objectively measurable goal that you could collect data and that we could measure whether or not it was successful. Data collection system. This was a particular problem with one of our pilots, but the proposal must identify how you're going to collect the data, how your agency will collect the data, how it's going to store the data, and what safeguards they're going to use to ensure that the participants, any personally identifiable information, PII, is protected. So you need to make sure that all of those things are specified in the pilot. You want to make sure that your data collection system is up and running at the time that the pilot starts. We had a proposal which was actually approved with the caveat that the agency was in the process of implementing a new data collection system that was supposed to be up and running when the pilot started. It wasn't, and the agency had continued to have problems during the entire run of the pilot. The issue with that is that it's important for your data collection to support your objectively measurable goals, and we can't do that if the data collection system is not working, because it's very difficult to collect that data by hand, to reach out to different parts of the agency and different offices to try and determine, what percentage of complaints are resolved and collect that information from each different and synthesize it all by hand. So we want to make sure that your data collection system is working as it's supposed to. Reporting. There are certain requirements for reporting. If your proposal is approved, we do require a detailed explanation of how you're going to evaluate performance and data on a quarterly basis, a yearly basis, and at the conclusion of the pilot. We require agencies who are participating in pilots to submit quarterly reports, and the specific dates are coming up in just a second. But there's a quarterly reporting requirement. At the end of year one, there's a year-end requirement, and at the very end of the pilot, there is an end of pilot report. And these reports would include your data collection and your data analysis to date at that time, and how you view the way the pilot is proceeding. Do you review it? Does your agency view it as being successful? Are there certain things that your agency has noted that you need to work on? Is there a reason why the pilot may not be working as well as you thought it would? Are there methods that you're going to use to correct it? That kind of thing. But we want to see those. We want to see those reports, and we really would like for them to be on time. We would prefer not to have to go looking for reports. Again, the agency must provide quarterly data reports to the Commission. This is specified in the toolkit. January the 15th, April the 15th, July the 15th. Those are your quarterly report deadlines. Year one by November the 1st. And the final pilot report within 90 days of the completion of the pilot. Minimal data requirements. There are certain minimum requirements that we like to see in a pilot proposal. These include the total number of complaints opting in and opting out. That's helpful to determine the interest in pilots for us and for you all to see how many people are opting in and how many people are opting out, and how many people were offered the pilot. Again, this goes back to where we were talking about the criteria for participation. It's not everybody, if it's agency-wide, or if it's broken down into a smaller group of people. The average age of the complaints in the pilot versus the average age in the traditional EEO process. Is the pilot helping to get EEO complaints processed more quickly, or is it taking a little bit longer than average? That's important to know. Also, updated data relevant to your objectively measurable goals, and we've been talking about that for a little bit. Data analysis questions. Some questions that you may have about data analysis that we will try and answer before you have a chance to make them. The Commission recognizes that not all EEO staff are experts at data collection. I myself am not an expert about data analysis. That is not normally my wheelhouse. And the Commission recommends that if you have questions about data collection, if your agency has a division or an office that does that type of thing, that you reach out to them for guidance and advice on how you should set up your data analysis plan. Agencies can also reach out to OFO. Again, we're not data analysis experts, but we can try to reach out to people in the agency that are more familiar with data collection. But we really encourage you to reach out to any staff that you have at your agency to help you with the data analysis questions that you have. What should my agency do? If you've sat through this presentation and you've listened to Navarro and you've listened to me and you're still interested in submitting a pilot proposal, we would love to entertain those. So what do I do? What do I do? I've now figured out that I think this is something that my agency could do, and we have a good idea of what we think should be changed. You must submit your proposal again to the Commission between March 31st and April 15th of this year. Or again, if you, like Navarro said, if you have a really good idea and you just can't quite get it submitted by April the 15th, consider, working on it and submitting it next year. That's perfectly fine. Proposals should be emailed to the Federal Sector EEO at eeoc.gov email, using the pilot request in your subject line so it gets to the right folks. If you're looking for more information, Navarro and I have mentioned these things, but the toolkit is a great place to start. It has an FAQ section. It goes through the process, and so it's a helpful starting point. Again, there's the link to the GAO report if you want to get really in depth into the data analysis and objectively measurable goals and what the GAO has to say about that. And again, you can always email questions to the Federal Sector EEO at eeoc.gov email using pilot question in your subject matter. Again, I'm happy to entertain questions and arrange to talk to people on the phone if you're really interested. My email is not on here, but again, it's robyn.dupont@eeoc.gov. And now that's the end. We've made it through our 64 slides that Navarro mentioned. And so now we're ready to entertain any questions that you might have. If things have just not been totally just a total jumble of information that we've thrown at you for the last hour or so.
All right. Well, thank you for the great presentation, Robyn and Navarro. Thank you, guys, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.